Okay, intermediate macroeconomics. My name is Mike Berry, and I'm an economist and lawyer, and my job here is to give you an introduction about what the class would be like. And generally, you have had, I know, um, principles, of course, and we study the behavior of entire countries or perhaps the entire world economies because policymakers, we don't like unemployment, inflation, poverty, inequality. What can we do to reduce those things? We have models. Also, we do like productivity, efficiency, more output, technology, innovation, economic growth. What can we do to help that, increase that? And so we have models to do that, right? This course will be continuation, but some more math, more quantitative modeling, right? Now with that, some of the themes you remember is we can model different time frames, the thing like the short run and business cycle, the longer run equilibrium and full employment and capacity. We can get into the very long run as well. You were familiar with aggregate supply and aggregate demand, what's going on there. We can talk about unemployment and inflation, the trade-off between the two, and rational expectations and the Phillips curve and good stuff like that. Number seven, I kind of think is most important, best, very useful model, elegant model, because it's almost like the model of everything. It's you've learned the parts, different markets. Here we combine them into one kind of nice model. I'll talk about it more in a minute. Of course, monetary and fiscal policy under these different modeling regimes, international policies, tariff and exchange rate movements, what happens and the effects between countries. Finally, we'll have a segment where we go into the parts of GDP, things like consumption. Let's go deeper into understanding what's in the mind of a consumer because they make up 2/3, 3/4 of a market economy. So policymakers really love to be able to understand what makes them think and tick and behave. Same thing for business investment spending. And then finally, we will look at financial markets and how they're all connected, how investors navigate them through those, how we can actually use them for forecasting future GDP. So this would be things like the money market, right? The stock market, the bond market in different countries, the spot foreign exchange market, the futures exchange market, and what kind of transactions go through all of them. All right, so moving on, a little more detail. I'm going to go fast, show you some graphs. Behind these are math, right? But if they look crazy right now, don't worry. It's just to show you, give you the flavor of what's coming. This one's easy, right? You know, in the short run, we got this up, down GDP. We can model that. We also, in the longer run equilibrium, we have this hopefully upward sloping trend, right? In the short run, what are we looking at? We're trying to get rid of, understand unemployment and inflation, recessions and booms. We have different policies to get rid of those, right? We're in the longer run equilibrium. Now we're looking at more productivity and technology and GDP growth and efficiency. Here, these are different types of sort of more supply side and capacity models or resource endowment type models. We also, a little bit new, I think, to probably most of you, will look at what we can call the very long run or developmental economics. How can a poor country become a rich country? That is a very different policies. Here we could be talking about decades. China, of course, has been very successful. We can have different ways of modeling this and looking at this. Here's a graph that looks perhaps a little crazy. Don't worry. It's a very famous solo model, and then we'll talk about endogenous growth models. Output and talk about savings over time and depreciation of capital and needs for a growing population. And what we're going to do is we'll study and we'll learn that capital endowment or capital stock is very important for a country, right? To become richer, what do you need? A poor country, they need factories and they need plant and equipment and they need highways and they need roads and they need irrigation and electricity and they need all that stuff, but it's expensive to get. So if you're poor, how do you get that expensive stuff to be able to get rich, right? It's kind of a circular thing. That's the kind of modeling we'll do. The very long run. Okay, looks crazy, but don't worry, you will get that. All right, some more flavor of stuff, aggregate supply, aggregate demand. You know this, we can use it to look at monetary policy, fiscal policy. You got a short run aggregate supply curve going up like this. We can talk about the Keynesians and the monetarists and their different views and also aggregate demand. What makes these things shift? We use equations and math to be quantitative about them, but then we can look at the effect of fiscal stimulus or loosening of money supply or lowering of interest rates. This is a graph of the United States economy today. My government, right, and Federal Reserve are trying to do this to help us with the 33 million Americans who don't have jobs today because of coronavirus, right? So we can model this kind of thing. All right, more stuff. You've seen some of this on here. I can move quickly. Is the big one. A great model, ISLM BOP model. It connect the markets, the money market, the goods market, the foreign exchange market, trade, imports, exports, all connected, right? Here's a graph, perhaps the most complicated looking one right now. So again, don't worry. In the end, it's just 3 lines. But we will use this and the math behind it to be able to do this. Everything affects everything in an economy. So here's a line, for the goods market, and we'll learn what's going on inside of it. Here's a line for the money market, banks and savers and borrowers, what's going on with money demand and money supply. We'll also look at balance of payments, exports, imports, foreign exchange and investment, and what's going on inside of it. So it looks kind of crazy, a little complicated, but it's everything affects everything else. And we can use that to model what happens when the government has a policy or Federal Reserve does something different, right? Next, a little more flavor, of what's coming would be, that exchange rates have different systems or regimes. So, for example, China has had in the past, especially, a fixed exchange rate, right? If you have a fixed exchange rate, there's an advantage perhaps that fiscal policy tends to work pretty well, but monetary policy is not as effective. On the other hand, if a country chooses a flexible exchange rate, it's kind of flipped, that fiscal policy is not very effective, but monetary policy is. What's going on with all that? How do we know this, and what are the advantages, disadvantages? That's kind of what we can do here. I like the use of historical crises, whether it's the Asian financial crisis, the Mexican crisis, the Russian crisis, or the Greek or the Eurozone crisis, to flush out, how does a modern open market economy work, especially when things go wrong. So one example, just so you have something to look at, would be Mexico. 1994, what's going on here? It's a picture of people, investors panicking, thinking, whoa, Mexico, something's wrong, I want out. I don't want to stay here because things are going bad soon. So I don't want pesos. I want dollars or euros or something. I want out. If you're in Mexico in that picture in 1994, what do? We'll study that. We'll study the options for the central bank or for the fiscal authorities. We'll also look at other options. Like here's one, just for example, is Mexico can turn to the International Monetary Fund and say, hey, our central bank is running out of reserves. Can we borrow hard currency? With that hard currency, they can defend the peso, right? In other words, buy the pesos that nobody in the world seems to want and keep up the exchange rate and prevent big domestic suffering, right? We can do that for a lot of countries, and the goal is a little bit of history, but also maybe in 10 years, 20 years, you'll be in a country where something similar would happen. So useful. All right, consumption. Let's go deeper than just rich people spend more than poor people. So one famous example would be the life cycle hypothesis. This is the idea that over time, hopefully we live many many years, but maybe you want to retire. So let's say I'm going to retire, at some time, I'm 65 years old or something, and then unfortunately, me too, and I'm going to die. Probably then my income over my life is going to look something like this green line, right? I'm going to earn money up until the time I retire, and then I'm not going to earn much money. So that suggests I got to think ahead a little bit, and because as an old man, I still want to eat and have shelter and live a life, spend money, consumption. So as a young man, perhaps I got to think about how much to save, and then as an older man, right, I'll have savings built up that I can spend, dis savings, negative savings. So that's sort of a wealth increase up till you time to retire, and then use your wealth to spend money when you're an old person, right? That's a deeper look at how consumers behave, and it can vary across cultures, right? Across time, across age groups, across whether you have children or don't, or whether. So very interesting. Another famous one is the idea is that people can with the help of financial banks, etc., they can move their paychecks into the future or into the past. Same thing with your pleasure consumption. You can move your pleasure of consumption into the future or into the present, right? That's because, some people borrow. That's essentially moving your paycheck and pleasure to today at the expense of tomorrow's pleasure. Or you can save, where you postpone your pleasure by using your paychecks and pushing them into the future. And we'll have some math, some equations to look at that. It'll help us with a perhaps funny, crazy looking graph like this, but it actually is pretty easy, where you have a budget line of what you can consume in different periods. Some people, of course, are more savers. Other people are more like borrowers, like this. What's going on? Who are you? If the interest rate changes, how do you change or I change? How does the country change? That's deeper looking at consumption. We want to do the same thing for business private investment spending, because we know businesses, when they invest, it's great for GDP now, but it's also great for capacity for 10, 20, 30 years of a country. What makes businesses tick? We can do a little bit more look at sensitivity to interest rates or to inflation expectations or to GDP growth, etc. Okay, so I can't talk forever. Logistically, our course, right, would be 2 quizzes, 2 exams. One, I'll ask you to do presentation, kind of like this, right? And then some participation attendance where we can talk. So that is our course, Intermediate Macroeconomics. I am sad not to see you in person this year, but it's good. I hope that you're all safe and healthy, and we will talk more. So Intermediate Macroeconomics. Okay, bye-bye.